In the hills outside Medellin, where the fog clings to coffee plantations and hope fades with each passing harvest, two young souls made a choice that would test everything they believed about love, courage, and survival. Mateo, 24, with calloused hands from years of farm labor, and Isabella, 22, whose bright eyes had not yet learned the language of defeat, stood at the edge of their small rented room and counted their savings for the 100th time. 3 million pesos, everything they owned, sold or pawned. The television, Isabella's grandmother's ring, the motorcycle Mateo had rebuilt with his own hands. It was barely enough, but it had to be, because staying meant dying slowly, and leaving meant at least the chance to breathe. The town they lived in had no name worth remembering, just another cluster of zinc roofs and broken dreams in the Colombian countryside, where young people left and never came back, where mothers prayed to saints who had long stopped listening. Mateo worked 14-hour days on a plantation owned by a man who paid in promises and threats. Isabella cleaned houses for families who looked through her as if she were made of air. They were invisible, expendable, forgotten. But together, in the quiet hours before dawn, they dared to dream of something more. Madrid, a city they had only seen in photographs, where buildings touched the sky and people earned enough to eat 3 meals a day, where migrants, they had heard, could find work if they were willing to bleed for it. And they were. We will give everything, Isabella thought, her fingers intertwined with Mateo's. Everything, except each other. The night before their departure, they stood on the hill overlooking their town, the stars above them indifferent and eternal. Mateo pulled Isabella close, feeling the rapid beat of her heart against his chest. The air smelled of earth and rain, of all the things they were leaving behind. He wanted to say something profound, something that would capture the magnitude of this moment, but words felt too small, so he whispered the only truth that mattered. No matter what, we find each other again. Isabella nodded, tears streaming down her face, her voice barely audible. No matter what. They sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted of salt and fear and desperate hope. Neither of them knew that promises made under stars are the most dangerous kind, because the universe loves to test them. Neither knew that in 48 hours they would be ripped apart by forces beyond their control, thrust into a nightmare that would make their Colombian poverty seem like a distant, almost gentle memory. The metaphor is simple and cruel. They were two seeds trying to plant themselves in foreign soil, not knowing that sometimes the earth swallows you whole before you can ever grow. But this story, the one you're about to hear, is not just about separation or suffering. It's about what remains when everything else is stripped away. It's about the stubborn, foolish, beautiful audacity of love that refuses to die even when logic screams that it should. And by the end, you'll understand why some journeys break you, not to destroy you, but to show you what you're truly made of. Will I see him again? Isabella wondered as they walked down the hill that night, her hand tight in his. The stars didn't answer. They never do.
The bus ride to Bogota took 12 hours, every kilometer a small death. Mateo and Isabella sat pressed together in the back, their backpacks clutched on their laps, watching their country slide past the grimy window. Emerald mountains gave way to sprawling slums, then to the cold gray sprawl of the capital. Neither spoke much. What was there to say? They had rehearsed the plan 1,000 times. Fly to Madrid on tourist visas, claim they were visiting for 2 weeks, then disappear into the vast machinery of undocumented labor. Simple, dangerous, necessary. At the airport, Isabella's hands trembled so badly that Mateo had to help her hold her passport while the immigration officer examined it with bored suspicion. But they passed. Two more invisible faces in the tide of desperate humanity flowing north, chasing rumors of dignity. The flight was a waking dream, suspended between two worlds. Isabella had never been on a plane before. She stared out the window as Colombia shrank beneath them, the mountains becoming wrinkles, the cities becoming scars. Mateo held her hand the entire time, even when it went numb. Somewhere over the Atlantic, she fell asleep on his shoulder, and he watched her face, memorizing every curve, every shadow. I will protect you, he promised silently. Whatever comes, I will keep you safe. It was a promise he would break in the worst possible way, though not by choice. 14 hours later, when the plane descended through gray clouds and the captain announced their arrival in Madrid, Mateo felt his stomach tighten with something between excitement and terror. They had made it. Now came the hard part. Barajas Airport was a cathedral of glass and steel, overwhelming in its modernity. Mateo and Isabella moved through the crowds like ghosts, following signs they could barely read, their hearts pounding as they approached passport control. The line moved slowly, too slowly. Mateo noticed the officers were pulling people aside, checking documents more carefully than he had expected. A cold dread settled in his chest. Isabella squeezed his hand. "It's okay," she whispered, though her eyes betrayed her fear. When their turn came, the officer, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a suspicious frown, examined their passport for what felt like an eternity. He asked questions in rapid Spanish they could barely follow. "Where are you staying? How much money do you have? What is the purpose of your visit?" Mateo answered as they had practiced, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his throat. Then the officer made a phone call. 2 more officers appeared. The words came fast, clipped, formal. "Please step aside. There's an issue with your documentation." Mateo's blood turned to ice. Isabella's face went pale. They were led to a small room, then separated. Mateo tried to resist, reaching for Isabella's hand, but a firm grip on his shoulder pulled him back. "It's just routine," an officer said, but his tone suggested otherwise. The last thing Mateo saw before the door closed between them was Isabella's face, her eyes wide with terror, her lips forming his name. He shouted for her, lunged toward the door, but hands restrained him, voices commanded him to calm down. And just like that, the promise they had made under the stars shattered into 1,000 pieces. Hours blurred together in that windowless room. Mateo was questioned, his belongings searched, his story dissected. They found inconsistencies, things he couldn't explain, proof they believed he was lying. He wasn't trying to visit, they said. He was trying to stay. And they were right. But admitting it meant deportation, meant failure, meant losing everything. So he held to his story, his voice growing hoarse, his mind fracturing with worry about Isabella. Where was she? Was she scared? Was she alone? Finally, near midnight, they moved him to a temporary detention facility on the outskirts of the city, a converted warehouse filled with dozens of other desperate souls waiting for their fates to be decided. He was given a thin mattress, a blanket that smelled of disinfectant, and nothing else. No phone call, no information, no Isabella. That night, lying on the cold floor, Mateo stared at the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and felt the weight of his helplessness crush him. "I'm sorry," he thought, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry, But what good are apologies when the person you love can't hear them?
Isabella woke in a shelter that felt like the end of the world. Gray concrete walls, rows of metal bunk beds, the smell of too many bodies pressed too close together. Women of all ages filled the space, their faces etched with the same exhaustion and fear she felt. She had been processed, photographed, fingerprinted, and then deposited here with barely an explanation. Her backpack sat at the foot of her bed, everything still inside, but it felt meaningless now. What good were clothes and toothbrushes when Mateo was gone? She had screamed for him at the airport, fought the officers until her voice gave out and her wrist ached from their grip. They had told her nothing, just that he was being held separately, that she would be contacted, that she needed to cooperate. But hours turned into a day and no one came with answers. The shelter operated on routines designed to keep people docile and manageable. Breakfast at 7, a thin porridge and stale bread. Lunch at noon, rice and beans. Dinner at 6, more of the same. In between, the women sat on their beds or gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones, sharing stories of the journeys that had brought them here. Isabella learned quickly that she was not unique. There were women from Ecuador, Venezuela, Peru, all with the same desperate hope, all separated from someone they loved. A woman named Rosa, older and weathered, took pity on Isabella's silence and sat beside her on the second day. "You're looking for someone," Rosa said. It wasn't a question. Isabella nodded, unable to speak without breaking. "Then you hold on to that," Rosa continued, her voice firm. "Because the moment you let go, this place swallows you whole." Isabella tried to find information, asked every staff member, every volunteer, anyone who would listen. But the bureaucracy was a wall, impenetrable and indifferent. She was given a case number, told she would have a hearing to determine her status, warned that it could take weeks or months without knowing if Mateo was safe, if he was even in the same city, if he was thinking of her the way she couldn't stop thinking of him. At night, she lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling, imagining his face, replaying their last moments together, the way he had reached for her, the terror in his eyes, the futility of his resistance. "Did I fail you?" she wondered. "Was this my fault?" Guilt gnawed at her, irrational but relentless, whispering that if she had been stronger, smarter, braver, they would still be together. The only thing that kept her sane was the memory of their promise. No matter what happens, we find each other again. She repeated it like a prayer, a mantra, a lifeline. Rosa noticed and one night asked about it. Isabella told her everything, the words spilling out in a torrent she couldn't control. The town in Colombia, the dream of Madrid, the separation, the desperate love that had carried them this far. Rosa listened without judgment, her eyes soft with understanding. When Isabella finished, Rosa placed a weathered hand on hers. "Then you don't give up," she said simply. "Love like that doesn't just disappear. It finds a way." Isabella wanted to believe her. She needed to believe her. Because the alternative, that Mateo was lost to her forever, was too unbearable to consider. Days passed with agonizing slowness. Isabella began to lose track of time, the shelter's routines blurring into a monotonous loop. She started helping with small tasks, cleaning, organizing supplies, anything to keep her mind occupied.
The staff noticed her diligence and began to trust her with more responsibilities. One morning, a social worker named Carmen approached her with an offer. A family was looking for domestic help, someone trustworthy and hardworking. The pay was modest, but it came with a room and the possibility of legal documentation if things went well. Isabella's first instinct was to refuse, to stay in the shelter where at least there was a chance someone might bring her news of Mateo. But Rosa urged her to take it. She said, "You can't help him from here, but out there, with money and connections, maybe you can." So Isabella agreed, her heart breaking even as she packed her bag, because every step away from that shelter felt like a step away from him. But what choice did she have? Survival, she was learning, sometimes meant moving forward, even when your soul screamed to stay still. "I will find you, Mateo. I swear I will." And somewhere in a cold facility across the city, Mateo was whispering the same words, praying they would somehow reach her.
Mateo's world became concrete and steel, repetition and exhaustion. The temporary facility released him after 2 weeks, with a court date months in the future, and a stern warning not to work illegally. But work was survival, and survival trumped law. A man named Diego, another Colombian who had been detained and released, told him about a construction company that didn't ask questions. The pay was terrible, the hours brutal, but it was something. Mateo took it without hesitation. He started at the very bottom, cleaning debris, hauling materials, doing whatever the foreman barked at him to do. His body ached, his hands blistered, but he welcomed the pain. It was better than thinking, better than remembering. Every night, exhausted and filthy, he returned to a cramped apartment he shared with 5 other men. They slept on mattresses on the floor, took turns cooking rice and lentils, pooled their money for rent. It was a life stripped of dignity, but Mateo didn't care about dignity. He cared about finding Isabella. He asked everyone he met, anyone who might have connections to the shelters, to the immigration system, to the network of undocumented workers scattered across Madrid. Most shrugged or shook their heads. A few promised to ask around but never followed up. The city was too big, the bureaucracy too opaque, the chances too slim. But Mateo refused to stop. Every pay period, he saved half his wages, building a small reserve in case he needed to hire a lawyer or bribe an official. He didn't know if it would ever be enough, but hope wasn't rational. Hope was the thing you clung to when nothing else made sense. On the construction site, a woman named Lena worked in the administrative trailer, managing schedules and payroll. She was Spanish, in her early 30s, kind in a quiet way. She noticed Mateo's diligence, the way he never complained, never missed a day, never caused trouble. One afternoon, she called him into the office and offered him a slightly better position, moving materials with a small crew instead of cleaning alone. The pay increase was minor, but it meant being seen, being valued, even in the smallest way. Mateo accepted with gratitude, though his mind was always elsewhere. Lena sensed his distance, the shadow that followed him, and one day she asked if he was okay. Mateo hesitated, then told her the truth. About Isabella, about the separation, about the promise. Lena listened with genuine sympathy, and when she finished, she said something that stayed with him. Love like that doesn't fade. It waits. And if she's out there, she's waiting too. Meanwhile, across the city, Isabella began her new life in the mansion of the Navarreg family. The house was enormous, a sprawling estate in one of Madrid's wealthiest neighborhoods, all marble floors and tall windows overlooking manicured gardens. Señora Navarro was a stern but fair woman in her 50s, a successful lawyer who expected perfection but paid well. Her husband traveled constantly for business. Her son, Adrián, was 26, charming in a careless way, used to getting what he wanted. Isabella's duties were exhausting but straightforward. Clean, cook, manage the household while the family went about their privileged lives. She kept her head down, worked without complaint, and tried to blend into the background. But Adrián noticed her immediately.
He started small, complimenting her cooking, asking about her life, lingering in rooms where she worked. Isabella responded politely but distantly, offering nothing that might encourage him. But Adrian was persistent, and his interest grew into something more unsettling. He began buying her small gifts, expensive chocolates, a new phone, things she refused as gently as she could. One evening, after a particularly long day, he cornered her in the kitchen and asked her directly to join him for dinner. Isabella's exhaustion turned to steel. She looked him in the eyes and said, her voice soft but unyielding, "My heart belongs where my soul learned to dream." Adrian stared at her, stunned, as if no one had ever said no to him before. Then he laughed, a bitter, embarrassed sound, and walked away. But the tension lingered, a reminder that even here, in this safe space, she was vulnerable. At night, in her small room above the garage, Isabella would open the window and stare at the stars. They were the same stars she and Mateo had looked at in Colombia, though they felt impossibly far now. She imagined him somewhere in this vast city, doing the same thing, and the thought was both comforting and heartbreaking. "Are you thinking of me?" she wondered. "Are you safe? Are you still fighting?" She had no answers, only the ache of absence and the stubborn refusal to let go. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and still there was no sign of him, no word, no miracle. But she kept working, kept saving, kept hoping, because what else was there? Survival without hope was just slow death, and Isabella wasn't ready to die. Not yet. Not while there was still a chance, however small, that the universe might honor the promise that they had made. But how long could a heart wait before it forgot how to beat?
Adrian's obsession with Isabella grew like a weed, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. He stopped trying to hide it, his eyes following her through the house, his questions becoming more personal, more invasive. He asked about her past, about Colombia, about why she had come to Spain. Isabella deflected with vague answers, but Adrian was relentless. One afternoon, he invited her to sit with him on the terrace, insisting she take a break. She refused politely, but he pressed, his tone shifting from charming to entitled. "You work too hard," he said. "Let me take care of you. You don't have to live like this." Isabella's stomach turned. She recognized the language of privilege, the assumption that money could buy anything, even a person's heart. She stood, her voice calm but firm. "I appreciate your kindness, Señor Navarro, but I don't need to be taken care of. I need to work." She left before he could respond, her hands trembling with suppressed anger. But Adrian didn't give up. He began leaving gifts in her room, expensive jewelry she immediately returned, perfume she refused to open. He wrote her notes, filled with flowery language about her beauty and innocence, words that made her feel sick. She considered leaving, finding another job. But the Navarros paid well, and the documentation they had promised was her only chance at stability. So she endured, building walls around herself, avoiding Adrian whenever possible. One evening, desperate and frustrated, he confronted her again, this time with tears in his eyes. "Why won't you give me a chance?" he pleaded. "I can give you everything." Isabella looked at him, this man who had everything and understood nothing, and felt a profound sadness. "Because everything is not what I want," she said softly. "I want one person, and he's not you." Adrian's face twisted with hurt and anger. He stormed off, and for days he avoided her completely. Isabella hoped it was over, but Señora Navarro noticed the tension and called Isabella into her office. The conversation was brief and uncomfortable. The older woman didn't accuse Isabella of anything, but her warning was clear. "My son is passionate. He doesn't handle rejection well. I would prefer if you maintained a professional distance." Isabella wanted to scream that she had done nothing to encourage him, that his passion was not her responsibility. But she nodded and left, knowing her position was more precarious than ever. That night, alone in her room, she broke down, sobbing into her pillow, feeling the weight of isolation crush her. "Mateo, where are you?" she cried silently. "I can't do this alone." Across the city, Mateo faced his own temptations, though they came wrapped in kindness rather than obsession. Lena had continued to show interest in him, not romantically at first, but with a genuine care that was hard to ignore. She invited him to lunch, bought him coffee, asked about his day. Mateo appreciated her kindness but kept his distance, polite but guarded. Lena noticed, and one day as they sat in the trailer going over schedules, she asked him directly, "Are you still looking for her?" Mateo nodded, his throat tight. "Every day." Lena smiled sadly. "And if you never find her?" The question hung in the air, brutal and necessary. Mateo stared at his hands, roughened by months of labor, and felt the doubt creep in. What if Isabella had been deported? What if she had moved on? What if the promise they made was just naive hope, crushed by the reality of their situation? But then he remembered her face, the way she had looked at him under the stars, the absolute certainty in her voice. No matter what happens, we find each other again. And he knew, deep in his bones, that he couldn't give up. Not yet. He looked at Lena, his eyes filled with sorrow she couldn't fully understand, and said simply, "Then I keep looking." Lena nodded, and though she didn't say it, Mateo could see the disappointment in her expression. She cared for him, maybe even loved him in her own way, and he hated that he couldn't return it. But his heart was not his to give. It belonged to a woman he hadn't seen in months, a woman who might not even be in the same country anymore. And still he held on, because letting go felt like dying, and Mateo wasn't ready to die. Not yet. Not while there was still breath in his lungs and stars in the sky. But how long could hope survive in the dark before it finally burnt out? And what would be left of him if it did?
The raid came without warning, a coordinated sweep through immigrant neighborhoods that sent panic rippling through Madrid's undocumented community. Isabella was at the Navarro mansion when she heard the news, a text from Rosa warning her to stay inside, to keep her head down. But later that evening, Senora Navarro received a frantic call from a friend whose housekeeper had been detained. The woman was hysterical, begging for help, and Senora Navarro, to Isabella's surprise, agreed to provide temporary shelter for 2 other domestic workers in danger of arrest. She instructed Isabella to prepare the guest quarters and said nothing more about the legality or risk. Isabella worked quickly, her heart pounding, knowing that what they were doing could have serious consequences. But she also knew what it felt like to be hunted, to be afraid, to have nowhere to turn. The 2 women arrived late that night, their faces pale with terror, their belongings stuffed into plastic bags. Isabella welcomed them, offered food and comfort, and listened as they told their stories. Both had crossed borders illegally. Both had families depending on them. Both were one misstep away from losing everything. Isabella saw herself in them, saw Mateo, saw the thousands of others like them navigating a system designed to keep them invisible and exploitable. That night, as she lay in bed, she felt a strange mixture of pride and fear. She had helped, had done something good, but she had also exposed herself, made herself more visible, and visibility in her world was dangerous. Meanwhile, at the construction site, the raid hit even harder. Immigration officers swept through during lunch, detaining a dozen workers, including several men Mateo had lived with. The chaos was immediate and brutal. Men ran, others froze, and the officers moved with practiced efficiency, checking papers, handcuffing those who couldn't produce documentation. Mateo was working in a different section when it happened, and by the time he arrived, the arrested workers were being loaded into vans. One of them was Diego, the man who had helped him find the job in the first place. Their eyes met, and Diego shouted something Mateo couldn't hear over the noise. Then the doors closed, and they were gone. The atmosphere on the site shifted immediately. The remaining workers were tense,
Suspicious, afraid, the foreman assured them that the company had not cooperated with the raid, that they would try to help the detained men, but the damage was done. Trust was fractured. That evening, as Mateo sat with the remaining crew, a supervisor named Raul addressed them. He was a hard man, weathered by years in the industry, but there was a flicker of sympathy in his eyes. He acknowledged the fear, the uncertainty, but he also made a request. The company had a major project deadline, and they needed everyone to keep working. He promised better pay, more security, anything to keep the remaining crew from disappearing. Most nodded, too desperate to refuse. But one man, a young Ecuadorian named Carlos, stood and accused the company of selling them out, of calling immigration to get rid of workers before they could demand better conditions. The accusation was explosive, and Raul's face darkened with anger. He denied it vehemently, and a heated argument erupted. Mateo, watching the scene unfold, felt something inside him snap. He stood, his voice cutting through the shouting. "It doesn't matter if it's true or not," he said, his tone calm but firm. "What matters is that we're all afraid, and fear makes us turn on each other. If we do that, we've already lost." The room fell silent. Mateo looked at Carlos, then at Raul. "If you want us to trust you," he said to the supervisor, "prove it. Help get Diego and the others out. Show us that we're not just bodies to exploit." Raul stared at Mateo, surprised by the challenge, by the quiet authority in this young man who had always kept his head down. After a long moment, he nodded. "I'll make some calls, but I need you all to keep working. Deal?" Mateo nodded, and slowly the others did too. The tension eased, though it didn't disappear. That night, Lena found Mateo sitting alone outside the trailer, staring at the city lights. She sat beside him, said nothing for a while, then finally spoke. "You were brave today." Mateo shook his head. "Not brave, just tired of being afraid." Lena smiled sadly. "That's the same thing." They sat in silence, and Mateo thought about Isabella, wondered if she was safe, if she was thinking of him. The raid had reminded him how fragile everything was, how quickly it could all fall apart. But it had also reminded him of something else, that even in the darkest moments, people could still choose to stand up, to fight, to help each other. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep going. But was standing up worth it if the person you stood for was lost forever? And how much longer could he fight before he finally broke?
If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss the next chapter of life, love, and redemption. Months passed, and slowly, impossibly, life began to shift. The construction company kept its promise, using connections to secure the release of several detained workers, including Diego. The gesture, though self-serving, built a fragile trust. Mateo's role expanded. Raul, impressed by his leadership during the crisis, promoted him to crew supervisor, overseeing a team of laborers. The pay increase was modest, but significant, enough to afford his own small apartment, enough to save, enough to feel, for the first time, like he was building something. But the promotion came with a cost. Mateo worked longer hours, carried more responsibility, and the exhaustion was relentless. Still, he welcomed it. Work meant purpose, and purpose meant he didn't have to think about how long it had been since he had last seen Isabella's face. At the Navarro mansion, Isabella's life had also changed. Señora Navarro, grateful for her discretion during the raid, began to treat her less like a servant and more like a trusted member of the household. She helped Isabella navigate the legal system, connecting her with a lawyer who could file paperwork for residency. The process was slow and expensive, but it was progress, real and tangible. Isabella's duties expanded as well.
She managed the household staff, coordinated events, and became indispensable. Adrián, humiliated by her repeated rejections, eventually stopped pursuing her, though his resentment lingered. Isabella didn't care. She had bigger concerns. Every euro she saved brought her closer to the resources she needed to find Mateo. She hired a private investigator, a gruff man who took her money and promised results, but delivered only vague updates and dead ends. Despite the progress, the ache of separation never faded. Isabella still opened her window at night, still stared at the stars, still whispered promises into the darkness. She had learned to live with the pain, to carry it like a stone in her chest, heavy but familiar. Rosa, whom she still visited occasionally, noticed the change in her. "You're not the same girl who arrived here," Rosa said one afternoon over coffee. Isabella smiled faintly. "Good. That girl was weak." Rosa shook her head. "No, she was scared. There's a difference." Isabella considered this, then nodded. Fear had driven her then. Now it was something else. Determination, stubbornness, love that refused to die even when logic demanded it should. One evening, Senora Navarro invited Isabella to accompany her to a charity gala organized by a coalition of businesses, including the construction company Mateo worked for, though Isabella had no way of knowing this. The event was meant to raise funds for immigrant support programs, an ironic gesture given how many of those businesses exploited immigrant labor. But Senora Navarro was on the board and attendance was expected. Isabella was reluctant, uncomfortable with the idea of dressing up and pretending to belong in that world. But Senora Navarro insisted. "You've earned the right to be seen." So Isabella borrowed a simple black dress, tied her hair back, and accompanied the family to the event. The gala was held in a grand hotel ballroom, chandeliers glittering overhead, the air thick with expensive perfume and self-congratulation. Isabella stayed close to Senora Navarro, serving drinks and making herself useful, blending into the background as she always did. But as the evening wore on, she felt a strange restlessness, an inexplicable pull she couldn't name. She wandered toward the balcony, needing air, needing space. And that's when she saw him. Across the room, standing near the bar, dressed in a suit that didn't quite fit, looking as out of place as she felt. Mateo. For a moment, Isabella thought she was hallucinating, that grief had finally broken her mind. But then he turned, his eyes scanning the crowd, and their gazes locked. Time stopped. The noise of the gala faded, the lights dimmed, and there was only him. Mateo's face went pale, his lips parting in shock, disbelief, and something that looked like prayer answered. Isabella's hands trembled, the tray she was holding slipping from her fingers and crashing to the floor. The sound shattered the moment, heads turning, people staring, but she didn't care. She moved, then ran, pushing through the crowd, her vision blurring with tears. Mateo moved too, shoving past confused guests, his eyes never leaving hers. They met in the middle of the ballroom, colliding into each other's arms, holding on as if the world might rip them apart again if they let go. Isabella sobbed into his jacket, her fingers clutching his jacket, and Mateo buried his face in her hair, his body shaking with relief and disbelief. Around them, the gala continued, oblivious or indifferent to the miracle unfolding in their midst. But for Mateo and Isabella, nothing else existed. They had found each other. Against all odds, against all logic, against the cruel machinery of borders and bureaucracy and fate, they had found each other. But finding was only the beginning. The question now was whether they could hold on.
They stood there, wrapped in each other, as the world slowly filtered back in, Whispers, curious glances, the awkward shuffle of guests stepping around them. Isabella pulled back just enough to look at Mateo's face, to make sure he was real, that this wasn't a dream. His eyes were red, his face thinner, older somehow, marked by the months they had been apart. But it was him. It was really him. "I thought I'd lost you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Mateo cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "Never," he said fiercely. "I never stopped looking." They kissed then, desperate and clumsy and perfect. And for a moment, the ballroom, the gala, the entire world ceased to matter. But reality intruded quickly. Senora Navarro appeared at Isabella's side, her expression a mix of concern and confusion. "Isabella, what's happening?" she asked. Isabella turned, still clinging to Mateo, and tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a rush. This was him, the man she had been searching for, the one she thought she had lost forever. Senora Navarro's stern features softened, and she glanced at Mateo, assessing him with a lawyer's scrutiny. "You work for the construction company?" Mateo nodded, still dazed. Senora Navarro's lips pressed into a thin line, then she nodded. "Come with me," she said. She led them to a quieter corner of the ballroom, away from prying eyes, and listened as they recounted their story, their separation, their months of searching. When they finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised them both. "I can help with your legal situation, both of you." The offer was unexpected, generous, and desperately needed. Mateo and Isabella exchanged a glance, hardly daring to believe it. Senora Navarro explained that she had connections, lawyers who specialized in immigration cases, who could navigate the complex bureaucracy they were trapped in. But there was a condition. They would need to prove their relationship, demonstrate stability, and, most importantly, they would need to continue working to show they were contributing to Spanish society. It wasn't charity, it was pragmatism wrapped in kindness, and they accepted without hesitation. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork, meetings, and careful optimism. Mateo and Isabella were inseparable, making up for lost time and stolen moments between shifts. They met for lunch when they could, talked for hours on the phone when they couldn't, and spent weekends exploring Madrid like tourists, rediscovering not just the city, but each other. The separation had changed them both. Mateo was quieter, more cautious, carrying the weight of responsibility that came with his promotion. Isabella was harder, more guarded, her innocence tempered by months of navigating a world that had tried to break. But beneath the changes, the core of who they were remained, and so did the love. Raul noticed the transformation in Mateo almost immediately. The young man who had been so distant, so consumed by sadness, was now focused, energized, alive. His work improved, his leadership became more confident, and the crew responded. Raul pulled him aside one afternoon and offered him another promotion, this time to assistant foreman, overseeing multiple teams across different sites. The pay was substantial, enough to think about a future, about stability. Mateo accepted, his mind already racing with possibilities. A real apartment, savings, maybe eventually bringing Isabella's family from Colombia. Dreams that had seemed impossible just months ago now felt within reach. At the mansion, Isabella's status continued to rise. With her residency paperwork in progress, Senora Navarro formalized her position, giving her a contract, benefits, and respect. Adrian had largely disappeared, spending more time abroad, avoiding the house and the woman who had rejected him. Isabella didn't miss him. Her life was full now, filled with purpose and the quiet joy of knowing that Mateo was just a call away, that they were building something together, slowly but surely. She started teaching Spanish to other immigrant workers in her free time, helping them navigate the language barriers that had made her own early days so difficult. It was small, but it mattered. One evening, as they sat in Mateo's small apartment, eating the simple meal Isabella had cooked, Mateo reached across the table and took her hand. "I want to ask you something," he said, his voice serious. Isabella's heart skipped, a mix of excitement and fear. Mateo hesitated, then smiled, a shy, boyish expression that reminded her of the man she had fallen in love with back in Colombia. "When this is all settled, when we have our papers, when we're safe, will you marry me?" It wasn't a formal proposal, no ring, no grand gesture, but it was everything. Isabella's eyes filled with tears and she nodded, unable to speak. They kissed, and in that moment, the promise they had made under the stars in Colombia felt complete. They had survived the separation, the fear, the impossible odds. And now, finally, they were building the life they had dreamed of. But even as they celebrated, a shadow lingered. Their legal status was still precarious. Their future depended on paperwork and bureaucrats and systems that didn't care about their story. One misstep, one rejected application, and everything could crumble. Mateo felt the weight of it, the responsibility of being the provider, the protector. Isabella saw it in his eyes sometimes, the fear that he was hiding behind confidence. And she wondered as they lay together that night if their promise had been enough, if finding each other again was truly the end of the struggle or just the beginning of another one. Because survival, they were learning, wasn't a single victory. It was a battle you fought every day in small ways and large against a world that seemed determined to make love and dignity luxuries only some could afford. And the question that haunted them both, though neither spoke it out loud, was simple and terrifying. How long could they keep fighting before the world finally won?
A year passed, and the life Mateo and Isabella built together was modest but real. They moved into a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but it was theirs. 2 rooms, a tiny kitchen, a balcony where they could see the stars on clear nights. They painted the walls together, furnished it with secondhand finds, and slowly turned the empty space into a home. Their legal paperwork had finally been approved, residency secured through a combination of Señora Navarro's connections, their employment records, and sheer persistence. The relief was overwhelming, the kind that made them cry without warning, that loosened a tension they hadn't realized they'd been carrying. They were legal. They were safe. They could breathe. Mateo continued to rise within the construction company, his reputation for hard work and integrity earning him respect from workers and management alike. He had become someone people looked up to, a leader who hadn't forgotten where he came from. He used his position to advocate for better conditions, safer practices, fairer wages. It was a delicate balance, pushing without alienating the company, but he managed it with a quiet determination that surprised even him. Lena, who had watched his transformation with a mix of admiration and sadness, eventually became a genuine friend, her romantic interest fading into a supportive camaraderie. She attended their small civil wedding ceremony, held in a courthouse with Rosa and a few other friends as witnesses, and she wished them well with a sincerity that Mateo deeply appreciated. Isabella left the Navarro household on good terms, Señora Navarro even attending the wedding and gifting them a generous check that helped them furnish their apartment. Isabella took a job at a community center, working with immigrant families, teaching Spanish and helping them navigate the legal and social systems she had struggled with herself. The pay was less than what she had earned at the mansion, but the work was meaningful in a way that cleaning and cooking for a wealthy family had never been. She saw herself in every frightened face that walked through the center's doors, and she made it her mission to ensure they didn't feel as alone as she had.
It was exhausting, emotionally draining, but it filled a space in her heart that had been empty for too long. They settled into a rhythm, a life that was far from perfect but undeniably theirs. They worked long hours, saved what they could, and sent money back to their families in Colombia when possible. Isabella's mother cried on the phone when she received the first transfer, unable to believe that her daughter, who had left with nothing, was now sending help. Mateo's father, a man of few words, simply said, "You did good, son." And that was enough. They talked about the future, about maybe one day opening a small business, about bringing their families to visit, about children, though that felt impossibly far away. But the dreams were no longer desperate fantasies. They were plans, grounded in reality, built on the foundation of what they had already survived. One evening, as they sat on their balcony, watching the sun set over Madrid's sprawling skyline, Isabella rested her head on Mateo's shoulder. "Do you remember what you said that night in Colombia, before we left?" Mateo smiled, his arm tightening around her. "No matter what happens, we find each other again." Isabella nodded. "We did, but I think the promise was bigger than that. It wasn't just about finding each other. It was about not giving up on each other, on ourselves, on the idea that we deserved more than what we were born into." Mateo was quiet for a long moment. Then he kissed the top of her head. "You're right," he said softly. "And I think we kept that promise too." They sat in comfortable silence, and Mateo thought about how far they had come. From the poverty of rural Colombia to the uncertainty of Madrid, from the terror of separation to the quiet joy of sitting together on their own balcony. It wasn't the life they had imagined when they sold everything and boarded that plane. It was harder, messier, scarred by losses they would carry forever. But it was also more real, more earned, more precious because of what it cost. He thought about the workers he now supervised, many of whom were living the same desperate hope he and Isabella had once embodied. He thought about the families Isabella helped at the center, the ones still searching for their own promises. And he realized that their story wasn't just theirs. It was part of something larger, a tapestry of struggle and resilience woven by millions of people who dared to believe they deserved better. "What are you thinking?" Isabella asked, noticing his distant expression. Mateo smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile that had become more common in recent months. "I'm thinking that we made it," he said. "Not just survived. We actually made it." Isabella squeezed his hand. "We did. Together." And in that moment, surrounded by the fading light and the distant hum of the city, they felt something they hadn't allowed themselves to feel in a long time: contentment. Not happiness, because happiness was too fragile, too fleeting, but contentment. The quiet satisfaction of knowing they had fought for something and won, not against the world, but alongside each other. And maybe, just maybe, that was the only victory that truly mattered. Yet even in this peace, a question lingered, unspoken, but present. In a world that seemed designed to break people like them, how long could contentment last? And when the next challenge came, because it always did, would they still have the strength to face it together?
Years passed, and the small apartment gave way to a modest house on the outskirts of Madrid. 2 children filled the rooms with laughter and chaos, a boy named Santiago and a girl named Luna, both born into a world far different from the one their parents had known. Mateo and Isabella worked hard to ensure their children never felt the hunger, the fear, the desperation that had defined their own youth. But they also made sure Santiago and Luna understood where they came from, the sacrifices that had been made, the promise that had carried their parents across continents and through impossible odds. Every year on the anniversary of their reunion at the gala, Mateo and Isabella would take the children to the balcony, point at the stars, and tell them the story. Not a fairy tale, but the truth, with all its pain and beauty intact. The community center where Isabella worked had grown, and she had become its director, overseeing programs that helped hundreds of immigrant families find their footing in Spain. Mateo had eventually left construction to partner with a small training organization, teaching skilled trades to young immigrants and connecting them with jobs. Together, they had built something that went beyond their own survival. They had created a network, a safety net, a community of people who understood that making it in a foreign land wasn't about luck. It was about solidarity, about lifting each other up, about refusing to let the world convince you that you were disposable. One evening, as Mateo sat with Santiago on the couch, helping him with homework, the boy asked a question that made him pause. "Papa, do you ever regret leaving Colombia?" Mateo considered the question carefully, his eyes drifting to the window where Isabella was watering plants, Luna chattering beside her. He thought about the years of struggle, the separation, the moments when giving up would have been easier than going on. And then he thought about everything that had come after, the reunion, the home, the family, the purpose. "No," he said finally, "because leaving wasn't the point. Finding our way back to each other was, and building a life where we could help others do the same." Isabella, overhearing the conversation, came over and sat beside them, pulling Luna onto her lap. "Your father and I made a promise a long time ago," she said to Santiago, her voice soft but firm. "We promised that no matter what happened, we would find each other again. And we did. But we learned something important along the way. Love isn't just about holding on to someone. It's about believing they're worth holding on to, even when everything tells you to let go. It's about choosing each other every day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Santiago nodded, absorbing the lesson in the way children do, storing it away for when he would need it. Mateo and Isabella exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them. They had given their children many things: security, education, opportunity. But the most valuable gift was the story itself, the proof that people from nothing could become something, that borders were lines on maps, not limits on dreams, that love, real love, could survive anything if you refused to let it die. That night, after the children were asleep, Mateo and Isabella stood on their balcony, just as they had so many times before. The stars above them were the same ones they had looked at in Colombia, the same ones they had whispered to during their separation, the same ones that had witnessed their promise. "We crossed the border once to find a future," Mateo said quietly, echoing the words he had spoken years ago at the community center during a speech that had moved everyone present. "But love is what gave us a home." Isabella leaned into him, her head on his shoulder, her hand in his. "And hope," she added, "hope is what kept us alive long enough to find it." They stood there in the quiet of their small but significant life and felt the weight of everything they had endured and overcome. The promise they had made under the stars in Colombia had been kept, not once, but 1,000 times over, in every choice to keep searching, in every moment they refused to give up, in every act of kindness they extended to others who walked the same difficult path. And as they looked up at the stars, Mateo and Isabella knew that their story wasn't just about them. It was about everyone who had ever dared to believe that they deserved more, that love was stronger than borders, that promises made in desperation could be kept through sheer stubborn will. The question they leave you with is this: in a world that seems determined to separate us, to categorize us, to tell us who belongs and who doesn't, what promises are you willing to fight for?
And when everything seems lost, when the odds are impossible, when giving up would be easier, will you choose to hold on? Because that, in the end, is what makes us human. Not the borders we cross, but the love we refuse to abandon. Not the dreams we chase, but the people we choose to chase them with. Mateo and Isabella's story is not unique. It is one of millions, whispered in 1,000 languages, lived in countless cities, carried by people whose names we will never know. But every single one of those stories matters. Every single promise kept is a victory against a world that bets on us breaking. So ask yourself, what is your promise? And more importantly, are you brave enough to keep it?
If this story touched your heart and you'd like to support this work, consider buying me a coffee on Ko-fi. Every small gesture helps bring more stories like this one to life. Thank you for listening, and remember, your kindness makes stories possible.